If you liked 11, you're going to love a dozen. Welcome to FTN From the Nosebleeds MMA podcast. My name is Brick Harris, and I am alongside, as usual, my good friend Blake O'Rulian, and we are here in the FTN studio ready to give you all updates and opinions on all things happening in the UFC, Bellator, and whatever it has to do with punching, kicking, or choking people out. We are brought to you by Sociwear Clothing. Big thanks to Robert Jemias. Big thanks to Don't Be Richard Music and all of our other sponsors and people who help us out. Today, we are very excited to offer you episode 12 of From the Nosebleeds. Blake, what are we going to be talking about today?
Today we got a big stacked show. We're going to be talking a lot about UFC 244 and what is to come. Round one, we're going to be talking about our UFC 244 takeaways. Round two, we're going to be rating UFC 244. We're going to give it an A, a B, a C, a D, or an F, what we thought of the actual event. Then we're going to be jumping into where do Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal go from here? What are they to look forward to? Round four, we're going to be talking about the 2019 Fighter of the Year and be debating who it is and why. Round five, we're going to be talking about this weekend's main and co-main events, Alexander Volkov versus Greg Hardy, and Calvin Kattar versus Zabit Magomed Shapirov, I believe is how to pronounce his last name. And then we're going to be jumping into our final thoughts. But first, as always, we're going to be doing top fives. And this week we did top fives a little bit different. If you follow us on Instagram, we gave it up to you guys. We wanted you guys to be a part of the show, and we wanted to give you guys an opportunity to give us a top five topic. So this week, Brick, do you want to explain what we're doing in the top five for our topic today?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very excited. We were talking about this just before, saying like, man, why didn't we come up with this? This is such a good idea.
Yeah.
So we are going to be talking about the top five fights that have never happened. Top five fights in the UFC that have never happened, that could have happened, maybe should have happened, but never did. And we kind of took that and we ran with it a little bit, saying, we're going to say, even though these fights possibly couldn't have happened because one fighter is, 70 years old now and the other is in his 20s, we kind of ran with it and we got a couple of really good lists out of it. So I'm going to go ahead and let you kick it off.
All right, so for my top five, honestly, there were so many different options and ways I could have gone with this between, do I want a fighter that never could have fought this guy, or do I want a fight that's about to happen or could happen or maybe won't happen, but I'd really like to see it. There's so many different options that I came up with, but these were the top five that sounded like they could have happened or they should happen, or I just really want them to happen. Number five, I'm going to go with Royce Gracie, Damian Maia in the gi UFC 1 style. I think that would have been so much fun. No time limit. How does Royce Gracie go up against one of the greatest MMA jiu-jitsu practitioners of all time in Damian Maia versus, the Godfather, the first guy that really put jiu-jitsu on the map on such a mainstream level in Royce Gracie. Number four, I'm going to go with Henry Cejudo versus Dominic Cruz. This is still up in the air, but I think a prime Henry Cejudo and a prime Dominic Cruz is one of the funnest fights you could ever make. And it is really interesting because, Dominic Cruz beat a Demetrius Johnson who was more of a 125er and ended up becoming a 125er after that. But Henry Cejudo walks around a little bit heavier than Demetrius Johnson. Henry Cejudo's wrestling is a little bit more dominant than Demetrius Johnson's. How would that fight have turned out? What would Cruz's footwork versus Henry Cejudo's lightning fast striking and his ability to take someone down, how that fight would go down, especially in their primes. Number three, I'm going to go with Vitor Belfort versus Chael Sonnen. I actually really like this fight. I think that of all the guys that Chael has fought, I think he, one, obviously never got the chance to fight Vitor Belfort, and two, I think both of these guys are so dynamic in their own ways, and these guys are two OGs that would have been so fun to match up in their primes as well. Number two, possibly happens in 2020, GSP versus Khabib. I think that is a wrestler's dream and a mixed martial artist's dream, and it could be up there if Khabib gets past Tony Ferguson. If Khabib gets past Tony Ferguson, GSP is pretty much the only guy left in his way, in my opinion, to become the greatest of all time. He's been so dominant, and to beat a huge name in probably one of the greatest lightweights of all time in Tony, and then to face the greatest welterweight of all time in GSP, there's really no argument there. So this really would be the battle for the GOAT, if not number one or number two. John Jones is obviously in there as well, but that would be a wonderful fight, and a reason why Khabib will not stop talking about it. GSP keeps saying, it's Khabib or I don't come back, and that is why it's so much fun. Number one, in their primes, let's say at 205 pounds, I'm stretching it a little bit. John Jones versus Anderson Silva. I think that would be such a fun fight. Two of the greatest strikers we've ever seen. John Jones a little bit better on the ground, but Anderson Silva absolutely in his prime has every skill and piece. Anderson Silva could Number one, I'm going to go with John Jones, Anderson Silva. Absolutely one of the greatest fights that could ever be put together. John Jones, Anderson Silva, two of the greatest strikers we've ever seen. John Jones a little bit better of a wrestler. Anderson Silva does have that jiu-jitsu game, and also in his prime. I mean, Anderson Silva could piece up anybody together. So that would have to be my number one.
And Anderson Silva did fight at 205.
Yes, he fought Daniel Cormier at 205.
In like a weird interim because that was when John Jones dropped out.
Right.
So it's not improbable to see Anderson Silva there, but you're right. Getting both of them in their prime at the same time, that's why we love these types of questions, because we get to get fantastical with our ideas and just kind of create a little fantasy. So now, on to my top five. I'm really excited about my list because a lot of these guys, these aren't really fights that I dream about or fights that I really, really want to happen. Like, fights that I really want to happen is Conor Gaethje. Right, but that could happen, and so I had to get a little bit of in my own head, little fantasy, and my top five don't really have an order. Right, these are just fights that I would love to see. First of all, Jose Aldo, Dominic Cruz. That would be, and let me clarify something. I want all these fighters in their primes, right? Like current, it wouldn't even be that interesting of a fight, but Jose Aldo in his prime versus Dominic Cruz in his prime. You've got the WEC king, Dominic Cruz, probably the greatest WEC fighter of all time, versus Jose Aldo, one of the greatest UFC lighter weight class fighters of all time. Both of them are very alike, very quick, very good striking, great footwork and head movement. Would have been an insane fight. Would have loved it. Now, Chuck Liddell, John Jones is my second. These two floated around the same weight classes their entire careers. Chuck Liddell was really the first star of the UFC, one of the biggest stars in the history of the UFC, and John Jones is kind of that bad boy of the UFC, right? He'll probably go down as, unless Colby Covington does something crazy off camera.
It's John Jones. It's John Jones.
It's John Jones. And so John Jones versus the greatest and the first star of the UFC would be a fantastic matchup for me. Conor McGregor versus Benson Henderson. I would love...
Striker's delight.
Exactly. Striker's delight. I would love to see this. Benson Henderson is bigger. He's probably got a better gas tank than Conor. We've seen it in both of their past fights, but in this would never happen, but a 3-round fight where, grappling isn't necessarily an option or a factor, Conor McGregor versus Benson Henderson would be insane. So much fun. Benson Henderson, also another WEC guy. That's why I love him so much. And then Conor McGregor, possibly the biggest star for the time being in UFC history. 100%. These two coming back and facing each other, both in their primes, would be insane. Now, okay, I'm going to save this one for last. BJ Penn versus Royce Gracie. I would love to see BJ Penn versus Royce Gracie, because if you look at BJ Penn's history, he has a history with the Gracie family. He's got a whole lot of losses. I think he's on a 5,000 fight loss streak for BJ Penn. So, I mean, definitely not in his prime anymore. But when he was, let's see, he defeated Renzo Gracie. He also defeated Rodrigo Gracie. He has a history with the Gracie family. He's also floating around the same weight class as Royce Gracie. And, there's something about a family rivalry that possibly could have been the undoing of Royce Gracie and the potential, massive fight that takes BJ Penn to the next level. It would have been tons of fun, a grappler's dream to watch. Both incredibly respectful fighters. Now, my last one, Khabib versus Tony Ferguson. This is probably going to happen in the future, but that's not why it's on my list, because these guys should have fought 5 times already. I'm happy to see them fight, but it's not going to be the same when they fight in March, April 2020 is when it's being rumored. Khabib versus Tony, when they were both in their primes, isn't necessarily right now. I don't think Tony's in his prime. I don't think Khabib is in his prime. When Khabib is talking about fighting Tony and then fighting a star like GSP for a money fight and then retiring, like you said last week, when this isn't what you want to do anymore, you're on a decline. And Tony Ferguson, I think he's on a bit of a layoff. He hasn't fought in a few months, and the last guy he fought was, Donald Cerrone? And he destroyed him. He picked him apart. But Donald Cerrone's like a 40-year-old veteran. It's just not the same. So taking these guys back 4 years ago, when this whole Khabib-Tony saga began and every fight was dropped, I want to see, this could have been the greatest rivalry in lightweight history. Because as you've explained, you've got a guy who's black belt in 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu in Tony Ferguson, and a guy like Khabib Nurmagomedov who is a wrestling superstar. You have an unstoppable force and an immovable object. And we could have seen these guys fight 5-6 times. Yeah. They both have the gas tanks. They both have the vigor and the ability to hold the belt at lightweight multiple times. This could have been the greatest rivalry of all time. That's why it's in my top 5. We'll see what happens in 6 months or so. But we could have had the greatest lightweight rivalry in the history of the UFC.
Oh, Brick. Always good with them top 5s. All right, let's jump into round number 1. What are your UFC 244 takeaways? Brick, what were your thoughts of the event and everything that came out of it?
Well, really quick, because I am going to touch on this in my final thought and kind of give a more in-depth explanation of what I think UFC 244 was. Not just, who fought, who won, the outcomes, but like the entire event as a whole, what it was and what it meant to UFC fans. So my biggest takeaway is Kevin Lee, in my opinion, might have had knockout of the year. I think that was
up there.
It was insane. Like, it wasn't a spinning back fist. I get that. It wasn't an up kick from his back, but the power in the 1-2 combo with hand and foot put Gregor Gillespie in a coma. Did not just put him to sleep. Absolutely mauled Gregor Gillespie's perfect 13-0 record. In my opinion, one of the most entertaining first round fights that I have ever seen. So hats off to Kevin Lee. Had an incredible night. I don't know if that's going to do a whole lot for him as far as the lightweight division, just because there's so many moving parts. But other than that, I mean, the main event was great. The takeaways from that, George Masvidal is a beast. I think he would have continued to pick Nate Diaz apart and gone on to win that fight regardless. But yeah, I mean, I'm going to touch on this in my final thoughts, but overall, good night. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I kind of see it on a different spectrum, and I agree. There were good moments. What I think was interesting, and I know this because of the polls we put out, almost everything we thought that would happen did not happen. You've got Johnny Walker getting knocked out in the first round, Gregor Gillespie getting knocked out in the first round, Stephen Thompson making it a kickboxing match, and it wasn't even competitive against Vicente Luque. You got Darren Till and Kelvin Gastelum being booed, and that was supposed to be rumored to be the fight of the night. I mean, that fight didn't really turn out to be the way it was, and then the main event ending in the way it was. I don't want to say it was disappointing, but it was just everything that we thought was going to happen did not happen. And I think that kind of rubbed people the wrong way. People were ready to see Gregor Gillespie, maul Kevin Lee and say, hey, I want a top 5 guy. We were waiting to see Johnny Walker say, all right, Dominic Reyes or John Jones, give me one of the two and let's go. I think people were waiting for Vicente Luque to become a great big star and to see Darren Till and Kelvin Gastelum box the lights out of each other and wait for someone to go to sleep. And then we were waiting for one of the greatest 5-round fights, one of the greatest street fights ever in Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal, and a doctor stoppage comes in the way of it. And so everything that we were hoping to see happen didn't happen, but we still got a good trade-off for the other side of it. I thought it was very interesting how I think the fight that I want to talk about the most, I guess I should say, is Darren Till, Kelvin Gastelum, and what Darren Till has been saying post, that he wanted to fake an injury, that he had a knee injury, that he doesn't want to fight Yoel Romero. What is going on with Darren Till, and is that why he was so timid in the octagon with a Kelvin Gastelum, someone who is undersized, someone who he could have used his length to totally just piece him up? And I mean, don't get me wrong, Kelvin Gastelum is no scrub, but Darren Till's got a good 4 or 5 inches on him. And so Darren Till fighting the way he did, all of these different things made my 244 event, in my eyes, just different than what I had expected, I guess I should say.
Yeah, I completely agree. However, my takeaways from the actual event itself, I mean, win or lose, Darren Till defeated Kelvin Gastelum.
He did.
Whether it was boring, whether it wasn't, no one's going to see that. They're going to see that, Darren Till defeated former interim champ Kelvin Gastelum. I think Darren Till, if he can man up and say, yeah, I want this fight, I think he could contend in the middleweight division.
100%. And that's I think why I was so shocked is because Darren Till is absolutely that guy that can do this in the middleweight division. And I mean, he even talked yesterday about going up to 205.
Yeah, it just wasn't like him, I guess. The pre-fight, even the fact that he was super late, and the fact that pre-fight interviews and weigh-ins were kind of weird, and then post-fight, yeah, he was like, I don't want to fake an injury. Like, this is not the Darren Till that people are used to. This dude was undefeated up until last year, and then he faced 2 nasty knockouts. I don't know if being asleep after getting punched in the face does something to the human brain, but maybe it did for him. I don't know. This could be the downfall of Darren Till, because a fighter's mentality is probably the biggest part of it. When you're going into a UFC fight, your mentality has to be a Conor McGregor. It has to be calm like a Khabib Nurmagomedov. You have to be confident, and you could tell he wasn't. And if he had gone up against someone who was more confident in themselves, like Robert Whittaker or Israel Adesanya, he would have gotten destroyed. All right, let's jump into round 2. This question, very, very interesting, came from a journalist, as Blake just told me, in an interview with Dana White, where he asked, what would you rate UFC 244? We're going to be talking a lot about 244. We just did a little bit, kind of gave our opinions of it, but right now we're going to give a grade, or we're going to give a rating to it. So Blake, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's the better word, a grade. For me, I would give UFC 244 a B- or a C+, and here's why. For how stacked it was, for how exciting the card was, and for the ways that it ended. I mean, let's be honest, every single person initially wanted Nate Diaz to continue on fighting. And then once we saw the particulars and we actually saw how bad the eye was, then we were like, okay. And I know a lot of people changed their standpoint on that. But in the initial moment of watching that main event, it was like, oh my gosh, like, we were waiting for a 5-round fight between these two. And then to get all of the other things that happen, I mean, just sort of more anticlimactic. I mean, nobody's talking about Blago Ivanov versus Derek Lewis. And Derek Lewis absolutely won that fight, and that was a great fight. But for some reason, nobody's talking about it. There was something missing. And maybe it was a spectacular call-out. Maybe it was a spectacular walkout. Maybe it was more personality.
A spectacular anything. Sorry to cut you off, but a spectacular anything.
Yeah, it was just a very... The word that I actually wrote down for this was anticlimactic. Everything that we had built this up to be for the last 3 months, because that's when Diaz had fought, or 2 months actually. For the last 2 months, I mean, the UFC 244 has been the card that everybody's talking about, and it was stacked, and we were ready. I mean, episode 11 was completely a UFC 244 show. And for it to end the way that it did, and for the lack of spectacular things to happen when we have tons of fighters who have made incredible things happen in their careers, we just didn't get those things.
Well, do you remember when we were sitting down in my living room watching the fight, and there got to a point where we just kind of looked at each other and we said, man, this is kind of going by fast, right? Mm-hmm. Like we're already at Gastelum Till. We were bored. Yeah. We were literally bored. We were watching the main card and we were going, okay, now what?
Yeah.
We were waiting for the big thing to happen, the big moment, the big UFC 244 thing that we're going to remember forever. And sadly, we didn't have it. The grade I'm going to give UFC 244 is a D. Wow. Barely passing. Here's why. Barely passing as a UFC pay-per-view event. Okay. That felt so much more like a free fight or an ESPN Plus UFC Fight Night fight, because you had the main card that felt like the undercard. Big names, could have been a lot of fun, but it was just kind of, okay, when does the main event start? When does the main event start? That's all we do when we watch UFC Fight Nights, right? UFC Fight Night, Yair Rodriguez, Jeremy Stevens. I can't even remember who was on the undercard or who was in the main card other than those two, right? The whole time we're just going, okay, yeah, good fight, main card, let's go.
And that's actually a great point. Though probably the craziest thing that happened was, and the biggest shock was, I mean, Gregor Gillespie and Kevin Lee was one thing, but without a doubt, Corey Anderson knocking out Johnny Walker, and that was on the undercard. I mean, that was for me. I was watching that part from home, but I was going, oh my gosh, like that just happened, like Johnny Walker just got knocked out. After that, it was really just, okay, this is kind of, this is just happening.
As far as impactful moments of the night, you're right. Corey Anderson, an undercard fighter, stole the night. Stole the show away from George Masvidal and Nate Diaz, albeit it wasn't their fault. It was a doctor stoppage. Sure. I mean, that was still a fantastic fight, but you're right. The undercard fighter of Corey Anderson literally stole UFC 244.
And I guess the question is, why do we both have this weird thought this weird feeling in our minds? And I think part of it is one, obviously the doctor stoppage, and then the fights before that on the main card. But also, was it The Rock coming out? Was it the BMF belt that everybody is saying is so lame? But Dana keeps saying, oh, it's our most expensive belt yet. It's our heaviest belt yet. It's all these things. But it gave sort of a fun feeling where the fight almost didn't matter. And was that because it wasn't for a title? Because it wasn't for a legitimate title, I guess I should say. All of that is up for grabs, and maybe this is a learning experience. I think Dana says, I don't want to run it back for this exact reason. He left with a sour taste in his mouth going, oh man, unless it's Conor, it can't be a title. It can't be a main event without Conor if it's not for a title belt.
I totally agree. And like I said, I'm going to talk a ton about this in my final thoughts, so I don't want to get too much into it. But you're absolutely right. The hype, in my opinion, ruined this fight. Yeah. You had a WWE star bringing out a belt that it didn't look cool. It didn't look like your traditional...
Everybody's ripping it online.
It didn't look like your cultural, like your traditional, your real UFC Octagon gold belt. It looked like... it was a toy, and it felt like we were watching a WWE event. No offense to any of our, listeners who enjoy the WWE, but
stop listening.
Yeah. And with that, we're going to go into round 3.
All right, let's jump into round number 3. Where do Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal go from here? Brick, I'll give you the floor.
Well, it's interesting. We've heard Dana White say he doesn't want to run it back, so let's just get that out of the way. We know that it's not going to be Nate Diaz, George Masvidal 2. That's next for these guys. I wouldn't be surprised to see it happen in a year or a few months, but it's definitely not going to be next. Nate Diaz, I think, deserves... it's going to sound terrible. I think Nate Diaz kind of deserves an easy fight. He kind of deserves a guy who's either up and coming and doesn't have the same jaw that George Masvidal has, or an Anthony Pettis, but I think that Nate Diaz deserves a name. He deserves a really good fight to get himself back into relevancy. George Masvidal, however, is very much in relevancy. I don't think there's a round of that entire fight that he lost.
No.
And to have the year that George Masvidal's had, and then to defeat a Nate Diaz in the BMF title the way that he did, I mean, it was super impressive. So I put George Masvidal in the top 4 of the welterweights. If he wasn't there already, I put him next in line to face Covington Usman.
So I see it a little bit differently. For Nate is so interesting now. From the moment he took Joe Rogan's microphone away and said, F that, Conor McGregor, you're taking everything I've worked for, he has gotten nothing but crazy money fights. And they haven't been title fights. They've been Conor McGregor, Anthony Pettis, former champion, Jorge Masvidal for the BMF title in the most marketed UFC event of the year. Nate Diaz is not coming back for anybody but a huge name. And those are the only 2 names that I think Nate Diaz will be able to come back against, and the only fights that Nate Diaz will accept, Conor McGregor 3 or Jorge Masvidal 2. Those are the only things left for Nate Diaz. He has had such a long career. He's got, double-digit losses. He has so much time in this sport. And just like his brother has no problem with leaving the sport kind of, anticlimactically. He didn't have this huge, going away party or anything like that. Nick said, yo, I'm done and I'm going to leave. Nate Diaz was gone for 3 years. Nobody heard from him, and not that nobody really cared, but it seemed like he didn't really care. And so I'm not surprised if he doesn't get one of those 2 offers. Nate Diaz, we never see him again. I really see that. And for Jorge Masvidal, your dad actually messaged us on our Instagram page, and I liked what he said when he said, be picky. Be picky. Take the money fight. And I think that's what he wants. And like I said, I think in episode 4 or 5, Jorge Masvidal, Conor McGregor is the fight to make. If we want to give Conor a fight that's, not Gaethje where everyone thinks that he's going to get smashed, and not Cerrone where everyone thinks that Conor's going to get a tune-up fight, let's give him Jorge Masvidal. He's the hottest guy in the sport next to Conor at the moment, and he's not going to get the Khabib fight with Tony in the way. Absolutely, I think that this is the next best thing that we can make is Jorge Masvidal versus Conor McGregor. And not only that, but Conor's been talking a little bit online. I mean, he talks about everybody online, but I think this is the most legitimate one where we can actually make something out of it. Masvidal's size versus Conor's, speed. Masvidal's power versus Conor McGregor's ability to knock guys out. I mean, it would be so much fun at 170, at 155 if Masvidal wants to make that cut. I like the money fight of Masvidal-Conor. I don't stylistically like the winner of Usman-Colby because he's absolutely up there for a title. He absolutely deserves it, but I don't like either of those fights for Jorge Masvidal stylistically.
See, now that whole time that you were talking, I was kind of shaking my head. I don't really want to see, like, when you first brought it up, I thought I didn't really want to see Jorge Masvidal, Conor McGregor, but in lieu of the welterweight title that's happening in just over a month, I think you might be right. Because Conor McGregor really needs a fight to come back with. George Masvidal is coming off, I don't want to say an easy win, but the dude was eating a quesadilla in the post-fight press conference.
I think it was pizza.
Was it?
Yeah, I think it was
like
pizza.
A flat, like, whatever.
It was New York style pizza, but I think he folded, whatever.
Sure.
Anyway, I'll shut up now.
No, but I think you're right. And because that welterweight title is happening, here's my thing. George Masvidal is next to fight the winner of Colby Covington, Kamaru Usman. There is no one else in that division that I think is more deserving. It's not Tyron Woodley. It's not Leon Edwards. It's no one but George Masvidal. And if they want to make a title fight, a money fight, which they have done in the past, haven't done so very recently, it's George Masvidal up against the winner of those two. Now, you're right. Colby Covington and Kamaru Usman are not guys to fight every 3 months like George Masvidal is. George Masvidal has had 3 fights, and I wouldn't be surprised if Covington or Usman drops out and George steps in. He's the type of guy to do that. So no matter what, a title shot in the welterweight division is next for George Masvidal, which is incredible. The guy they should be making an ESPN 30 for 30 for him because of how far he's come from the backyard fights with Kimbo Slice and having double-digit losses to now being the superstar, the guy of the UFC. But you're right. Put him up against Conor McGregor. I personally think he defeats Conor McGregor, and I think he does it pretty easily. Conor McGregor does not have the same power that these welterweights have that,
Conor had at 145.
Sure. And George Masvidal is just as quick as Conor. He's just as accurate as Conor, but he's got the power to open up a hole in Nate Diaz's face. And now people are probably going to be saying, well, Conor McGregor did that too to Nate Diaz. Not the same thing, though. It was not the same thing. After 3 rounds, they had to stop the fight because Nate Diaz's face was falling off of his head. Conor McGregor took him to 5 rounds, and he was still bloody and battered, but it's not the same.
It's not the same. No, I like it.
All right, let's get set. Let's get into round 4 of this show. This one's also a really fun question. Who is the 2019 Fighter of the Year? There are a couple guys that are up for it. There's a couple guys that I know you're going to want to throw in the conversation.
No, I mean,
there's guys that I want to throw in the conversation, but I want to hear who's your 2019 Fighter.
Okay, if you think it's John Jones or Khabib, like 1, John Jones hasn't been tested.
It's
2,
not.
Khabib has only fought 1 time. Henry Cejudo is the guy that I was thinking, because he's totally in that conversation. He's been talked about for the whole, this entire time. Henry Cejudo has totally been in talks of 2019 Fighter of the Year, but because of Jorge Masvidal's win on Saturday, it is absolutely between Israel Adesanya and Jorge Masvidal. And I think at the end of the day, it's Jorge Masvidal who has, the upper hand. In his first 2 matchups this year, Darren Till, Ben Askren, a combined record of 36-1, 1 no contest, 1 majority draw. But Darren Till and Ben Askren's combined record was something that if you match that up against a Jorge Masvidal and said, hey, who do you have in this fight? Nobody would have picked Jorge Masvidal. Nobody would have imagined the crazy knockout win against Darren Till. Nobody in the world would have guessed a 5-second flying knee knockout against an undefeated Ben Askren who was super hyped coming off of a Robbie Lawler win. Jorge Masvidal has mauled every single dude he has faced because even though he didn't knock him out, Nate Diaz has one of the craziest chins in UFC history. Jorge Masvidal has all 3 of those rounds, Jorge Masvidal won that fight.
And although he didn't knock him out, he shut the lights out on him. He shut the lights out for a split second.
In that early first round?
That up kick?
Yes.
That sent Nate Diaz to the floor?
Yes.
Nate Diaz had to collect his thoughts after that.
No,
sure.
100%. So not only that, but then you take Israel Adesanya, who beat an older Silva. He beat Gastelum, which was a great fight. And then he ran through Robert Whittaker, who hadn't fought in over a year, who clearly had a little bit of ring rust. And so I've got to give it to Jorge Masvidal. And because of that, I think Jorge Masvidal is now, which is unbelievable to think, but just in the year of 2019, Jorge Masvidal has put himself into a higher category, a clout category, as I would say, with Conor McGregor, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Nate Diaz, and now Jorge Masvidal. Those are the 4 biggest stars in MMA. And Khabib and Nate are those 2 big stars because their name is linked to Conor McGregor. Jorge Masvidal did that all by himself, which is why I pick him as the 2019 Fighter of the Year.
You just said everything that I wanted to say, so thanks a lot. I'll get to save some breath, which is good. I mean, I've been coughing all over the show, but no, I really do appreciate you making all those words sound more eloquent than I probably could have. So that's a good thing. But no, here you go. Here's my Fighters of the Year. Not just one. I don't have one. It's George Masvidal. There's no debate. There's no way that I could come back and say, well, Blake, I think you're wrong because of this. No. But Fighters of the Year, Conor McGregor, Ben Askren, Colby Covington, guys that we would put on the biggest loser totem pole of the year. But these guys have made themselves relevant through the UFC community. If you cannot get on at least our Instagram Explore page without seeing something about Ben Askren, something about Conor McGregor, something about Colby Covington, these 3 guys have made themselves probably just as relevant as George Masvidal without fighting. I mean, Colby Covington obviously had an incredible year, but through trash talk, through tweets, through being funny, like Ben Askren had a terrible year. He's talking about retiring after 3 fights in the UFC when he was arguably the most hyped up man to enter the sport. And he's talking about retirement. But these 3 guys have had 3 of the most impactful years on the UFC. If you go watch anything on a UFC Explore page or MMA Explore page about memes, about big argumentative topics, about who we're the most excited to see fight, it's these 3 guys. And they're not really doing anything. Colby Covington is doing all of this with his trash talk, with his super controversial wardrobe, with the things that he says. I've never seen anyone be booed more. I don't even think Chael Sonnen was booed this much when he went to Brazil.
No, not a chance.
Chael went to Brazil and completely belligerently was disrespectful to the people there. He was not booed nearly as much as the People's Champ was booed in his own home country. Like, mind-blowing. So whether he's winning fights or losing fights, whether he's Conor McGregor, Ben Askren, Colby Covington, it doesn't matter. These guys are talking their way up to the top of each of their divisions and in my opinion, Fighters of the Year without fighting. All right, now let's jump into round 5, our final round of the day. We are going to be talking about the UFC event that takes place this weekend between Calvin Kattar, Zabit Magomedsharipov. That's right.
No, you're
That's
right.
how you say it.
Right.
You just laughed at me as soon as I said it. And then we have Greg Hardy versus Alexander Volkov. Blake, make your picks.
All right. I like Alexander Volkov against Greg Hardy, and here's why. Greg Hardy is so hyped up. And yes, he has a half-inch reach advantage and things like that in Greg Hardy, and they're relatively the same size. However, Alexander Volkov, one, has had some time since his knockout against Derek Lewis. He's actually had a lot of time. It's been over a year. Greg Hardy has been very, very active. And not only that, but Greg Hardy, his confidence has to have been drained a little bit following that disqualification in his fight a few weeks ago with the inhaler. I like Alexander Volkov in this fight, not only for that, because just as heavy as Greg Hardy hits, Alexander Volkov hits very heavy himself. So
I agree, but I also very much disagree.
Okay.
Let me get into this. Greg Hardy wins this fight. For me, 10 out of 10. I'll bet you $5 right now that Greg Hardy wins this fight.
I'm not putting any money on this.
For the reasons that you just stated.
My mom raised me right, Brick. What's wrong with you?
For the reasons that you just stated, right? So Alexander Volkov is coming off a nasty, nasty knockout from Derek Lewis. That does something to a guy, especially in a division where Alexander Volkov isn't getting a title shot anytime soon, even if he defeats Greg Hardy. It's not even close. There's Francis Ngannou. There's still Derek Lewis. There's all these guys in the heavyweight division way ahead of him. So he's got a serious confidence issue, in my opinion, coming into this fight. Now, Greg Hardy not only had a very impressive, I'm going to call it a win, because he defeated Ben Sassoli. He did.
Yes.
Inhaler or no inhaler, he defeated Ben Sassoli. So he's coming off a win. That's going to do something for his morale. But not only is that doing something for his morale, but he's pissed off, right? He got a DQ that he doesn't think he deserves. He's got a chip on his shoulder, and he knows that right now it is fight or flight. It is do or die for Greg Hardy. So he comes in and he defeats Alexander Volkov and reinstates his name into heavyweight relevancy. However, if he loses to an Alexander Volkov, he becomes the inhaler guy and the guy who lost to the guy who was put to sleep by Derek Lewis over a year ago. So it is do or die for Greg Hardy.
Here's the thing. Greg Hardy is coming into his 5th fight of this year. Not only that, but his second fight in less than a month. And so it's going to be a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot to put in. He's been extremely active, but this is 37 fights versus a guy coming into his 7th fight. So I think Alexander Volkov also has just octagon experience. And so that's another reason why I push it. But I like your thoughts. When it comes to Zabit versus Calvin Kattar, I like Calvin Kattar. I think Zabit is a very good fighter and all those things, but I think that Calvin Kattar is one of those guys who is more of a mixed martial artist versus Zabit, who is a very, very talented striker. I like Kattar by submission. Zabit's one loss, I believe it's his one loss, is a submission loss, whereas Calvin Kattar has 3 of those in his career. And by no means is he some incredible submission artist, but I definitely do think that he's going to try to get this thing to the ground.
I give massive advantage to Calvin Kattar on the ground.
Yes.
And as we've talked, the UFC is developing, the UFC is evolving. I think a ground game is a lot more important than striking at this point. You've got the 2 guys in welterweight who are incredible wrestlers, Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington. You've got Khabib Nurmagomedov, who's ran through the lightweight division. Wrestling is very important, and Zabit Magomedsharipov is very thin. He's a great striker, but in my opinion, he's a Max Holloway with less power, with less oomph. So I think Calvin Kattar takes it to the ground and either wins via ground and pound or submission.
Not only that, but his win over Jeremy Stephens, although it was a unanimous decision, I was not thoroughly convinced by any means that he was, he won the fight, but I didn't think it was convincing by any means.
Right. All righty, my friends, welcome to Final Thoughts with Brick. Happy to have you here on this adventure we're about to go on. Now, my final thoughts deal a lot with everything we just talked about in the show, UFC 244. And the questions that I have for you are, what do you remember about 244? Well, I promise you that you're going to remember how much you didn't remember it. UFC 244 was the party that you got all dolled up for, excited, amped up about, and got nothing in return but a nasty hangover and some regret. But a hangover is just a reaction to the hype, not the party itself. You don't have a hangover for having a good time. You have a hangover for getting drunk and excited for having the good time. The party was lame, right? Everyone knows it because the party itself has no impact on you the next day, right? Don't be discouraged, though, my good friends. We have possibly the greatest 6 months in UFC history to look forward to. We are experiencing some of the most exciting moments to ever be experienced in the UFC. In the coming year, possibly coming months, let me tell you what we have. Covington versus Usman, Holloway Volkanovski, Nunes Durandamy, Jones versus Reyes possibly, right? Khabib versus Ferguson possibly. The return of the notorious Conor McGregor. Darren Till making a middleweight surge. Possible return of George St. Pierre. Tyson Fury to the UFC possibly. And then DC versus Stipe 3. These are just a few of the things we have to look forward to in the UFC. So don't let this hangover bother you for too long. UFC 244 is over. UFC 245 is on its way. 2020 is on its way. There's so many more parties to look forward to. Better parties, more important parties. And the pregame hype will not even be as close to the BMF title. And neither will the hangover. I can promise you that. Now, The Rock will no longer be there holding up a WWE-esque belt given to a fight that really means nothing in retrospect of the UFC and the champions therein. So don't worry. Don't get too hyped up about the next parties to come. Enjoy the parties and you'll be able to remember them. I promise you, the hangover will never be the same.
Remember in high school, there was always the most popular guy. Everyone wanted to be friends with him. He's got cool style, he's authentic, he's got a fun personality, and for the most part, he's a funny guy too. It almost seemed like anything he did, people were going to love it. I'm not talking about Conor this time. He was that guy until he got into too much trouble. He crossed too many boundaries. But when Nate Diaz called out Jorge Masvidal looked like a kid in a candy shop. And so did we. He could do no wrong. We love seeing Nate. We love rooting for Nate, his style, his authenticity, his personality. He's funny. He's just a cool guy. The BMF title was more than just a title of 2 guys who have kept it real forever. two guys with a lot of decision losses, two guys from the streets. The BMF title was a popularity contest. No real title on the line, but the second biggest event in Madison Square Garden history. Why? Because it was two fan favorites everyone wanted to see. But here's why Saturday was so unique. No matter who had more significant strikes, or who Bruce Buffer called the winner at the end, or who has the BMF belt now, Nate Diaz won. Nate Diaz won the popularity contest. It wasn't Jorge getting the cheers. It wasn't Jorge's fight to win. Despite an incredible performance from Masvidal, which absolutely makes him the fighter of the year and a shot at the 12-pound gold belt at 170 pounds, Nate got the cheers at the end of the night. Nate was robbed. Nate was going to win if he kept going into the 4th and 5th rounds. Nate had the gas tank. Nate stole the headlines. So Nate Diaz won the popularity contest, which is the BMF belt. The BMF title is something we will never forget. Not because of who won the fight. In fact, it really had nothing to do with winning. But it had everything to do with who is everyone's favorite fighter today. Who is the most popular guy in school? And the answer is still Nate Diaz.
Well, there you have it. Once again, Blake and I disagree on major topics of the show. However, it was a great weekend. It was a lot. It supplied us with a ton of stuff to talk about, so I'm not mad about that. But all we know now is UFC 245 is the next pay-per-view event, and I got chills.
I'm so excited for
so
it.
pumped.
We got Max Holloway, Alexander Volkanovski. We've got Jermaine Duranamine versus the GOAT at the women's divisions in Amanda Nunes. And we've got a wrestler's delight in Colby Covington versus Kamaru Usman. It's going to be fun, Brick.
I think that's the next best rivalry. Like, that's the next up-and-coming rivalry in the UFC. It's not going to be Colby Covington, Usman 1, and they're not going to run it back. This is a saga in the making.
It could be, and I'm very excited
And it's a real rivalry. They hate each other. Thank you so much for being... Wow, what a way to end. They hate each other. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for joining us on episode 12 of From the Nosebleeds MMA podcast. Big shout out again to Don't Be Richard Music. Thank you to Sociwear Clothing and Robert Jemias. Blake, anything you'd like to say? Unless it has something to do with Henry Cejudo, then we're going to go ahead and call it. Yeah, Don't Be Richard. Send us off.